The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Anyway, yes, I've done books on baseball. I've done books on presidential politics. I've done books for younger readers. And I did a book a while back, the decades fly by, on the gangster Arnold Rothstein. And when I did the book on Arnold Rothstein, its subtitle was The Life and Death of the criminal genius who fixed the 1919 World Series. And people would ask me, why'd you do that book? Because at that point, I was still the baseball writer guy. I had two degrees in history from the State University of New York at Albany, but I was still the baseball guy. And I wanted to do not a book on baseball at that point, I'd done a few, but on New York City in the 1920s. I was just fascinated by that era and that time and place. But I was faced with two problems. One, why should a publisher trust this baseball guy now to do this book? And two, which part of the 1920s should I take? And I was at the Albany Library, not this Albany, not this library, but the Albany Library downtown, and they had a box of books out there in the lobby, and it was take one for $1, we'll trust you. And it was a biography of Mayor Walker of New York City. And this Rothstein fellow kept showing up in all sorts of nefarious ways. And I thought, well, maybe there's a book there. And boy, was there a book there. It became, it was a finalist for the Edgar Awards from the Mystery Writers of America for Best Fact Crime. And has been optioned many times for motion pictures and may yet still get there. It's under current option, and if this option expires and they don't want it, I know somebody else who does. So it's a grand story of this Rothstein fellow. And this book here is basically a spin-off of that book, of that project. A couple years ago, a fellow who I met when I was doing streaming TV, and we'd talk about politics of the day, and we'd go back and forth one side or the other, was now doing a radio show out of New York City. And he was out of the Russian tea room, and he was focusing a lot on Broadway. And he says, could you come on the show and do a talk on Arnold Rothstein's connection to Broadway and Times Square? And I said, yes, I can. And the reason I was able to say that without too much hesitation and too many decades, or a couple decades almost, after writing the Rothstein book, is because shortly after writing the Rothstein book, I was asked to do a physical walking tour of Times Square, Arnold Rothstein's Times Square. And I still had the notes. And more remarkably, in the hovel that passes for my office, I was able to find those notes. And so I did the radio show, and I thought, well, I've got some text here. I bet I could turn out like a little pamphlet on this subject. And I tend to get carried away. And so this little pamphlet turned into, in a very short period of time, this book. And I was able to do that because I think as Archimedes said, give me a place on which to stand and I will move the earth. And so I had this place to stand named Arnold Rothstein, and his connections to organized crime and Gangsterland and that era, which extends actually kind of beyond the jazz at the 1920s. You know, his career starts in the teens. He doesn't get past 1928, but certainly Prohibition does. And the era of wonderful nonsense, the jazz age, etc., whatever you want to call it, goes on and on. And so with that starting point, then I was able to add other locations and then start to connect also to him. So if it wasn't directly connected to him, it might be connected to people who were connected to him, say Legs Diamond, or Dutch Schultz, or any number of those other people. And not all of these people were, shall we say, gangsters. Arnold Rothstein was also what you would call a legitimate businessman, okay? Like, you know, the Godfather, Corleone in The Godfather, Genco olive oil company or importing company. And so Arnold Rothstein would be involved in, well, if you would call loan sharking a legitimate business, he would be involved in that. That would be really the source of his power. There's a 1959 bio of him called The Big Bankroll, and that was one of his many nicknames that turned into a movie shortly thereafter starring David Jansen from The Fugitive. And so he would lend money, but he would also go into real estate. He owned an awful lot of decent, kind of prestigious buildings in the Carnegie Hall area of New York City neighborhood, which is, you know, then and now a good area. And also he was involved in insurance. So if you took out a loan from Arnold Rothstein, he would want it paid back. One of the reasons why he gets involved with mobsters early on, aside from that mobsters are gamblers, and he was a gambler par excellence, is that with you need, if you've lent money or if you've won money at a game, you need someone to collect. And so while he is not one of these, them, and those guys, he is, in fact, the scion, I guess you would call it, of a very respectable cotton merchant, very middle class. His father's known as Abe the Just. And so he hires these guys to collect. And he also, because he's running gambling houses, he needs protection. And when you need protection, you need it, well, from somebody who might want to rob you, but also someone who might want to raid you. So you become familiar with the politicians and you become familiar with the police. And so he is the spoke of the wheel of all these nefarious things that turn in New York City in the teens and the 20s, and, you know, really going on for quite a long time in the city, because the city is really mobbed up. And speaking of mobbed up, while the origin of the book was in the Times Square area, in the Broadway area, we break it down and we expand it. So there's a part one, which is that area, roughly stretching from Times Square itself to Columbus Circle, but also beyond that way, because much to my surprise, the Upper West Side was also very mobbed up. Maybe not so much in terms of the speakeasies, but in terms of the people who ran the speakeasies and where they lived. The brothels, which were far too numerous back then, and the crooked politicians or police officers, or where they lived. It was pretty easy to get down, and still is, from the Upper West Side into that Midtown West area, the Broadway area, and all that involved. Now, we run into certain categories of establishments in this book also. So how do you compile this? Okay? The newspapers today can be very circumspect about the details they provide. They won't tell you in many cases, you know, who got killed in Schenectady last night, what this person's name was, okay? They won't tell you what street or what the street number was of where something went down. Back then they were not shy about it. They would often tell you the apartment number where something happened, where maybe a murder, a jewel robbery occurred. I came across in the course of this research, I couldn't use it because it wasn't in the area and he wasn't a mobster, but it was a tour book written around 1920 or 21 of the city of New York. And, you know, you see this restaurant, visit the Statue of Liberty, et cetera, but also it would tell you where all the famous people lived. So it would say, Franklin Delano Roosevelt lives here at this address, and that would be public knowledge in a tour book. You would not see that today, but you would see such things then. And with so many things going online now, newspapers, either free or for subscription service, you can really dig and keep digging and find more and more stuff. And stories you weren't looking for, you just sort of stumble upon, and you come across characters you never heard of, but who have fascinating stories to tell. Now, you find even Wall Street people involved. So you'll find the addresses of like Charles A. Stoneham. And Stoneham is an interesting guy. Let's start with him. We all remember, or most of us remember, when the term New York Giants didn't just mean football, it meant baseball. And the guy who moved the New York Giants out of the Polo Grounds and out of New York City to San Francisco was Horace Stoneham, Charles Stoneham's son. Stoneham was a stockbroker, and we have his address, we have his apartments, we have his comings and goings. What kind of a stockbroker was he? A crooked stockbroker. They had a thing back then called bucket shops, which meant that what you would do is you'd say, I want to buy, Anaconda copper or something, and they would actually tell you you should buy Anaconda copper. And they would tell you this because the stock was overvalued. It might be overvalued because they were placing squibs in the press and the word on the street, so it would be, going up and up. But it was overvalued. And they would tell you to buy 100 shares or something, and you would give them the money. But they wouldn't buy it. They'd stick that money right in their pocket, and they would wait for it to crash. And they might even accelerate that crash. They might put more stories in the papers about this. And then they'd sell it and give you the money of what the selling price was now, but they had never really invested it, and they would pocket all the difference. Stoneham was a past master at that. He was protected in part by Arnold Rothstein when he bought the Giants from a guy named John T. Brush, who was known affectionately as John Toothbrush. In around 1917, it was Arnold Rothstein who brokered the deal. Stoneham also was, so we have a connection with this one person to sports and to Wall Street, and also to, Stoneham, if you've ever seen a picture of him, sort of looked like a big frog, a very unattractive guy, but a very amorous guy. He had a family up in Westchester. He had a real wife in New Jersey, and he had a mistress who at some point was involved in jewel robberies. And he had her in an apartment in the West 50s. And people actually thought that this was his wife, and she was not. Earlier in her career, she is involved in an incident at the Hotel Ansonia. The Ansonia is up around 72nd Street and Broadway. So it's one of those locations which is above the Times Square, Greater Broadway area. The Ansonia is mostly known, and the Ansonia is interesting because it falls into one of these categories where, as I say, some of the people go between different categories of nefariousness, and certain buildings do too. So living at the Ansonia is, say, Flo Ziegfeld. Flo Ziegfeld is the great producer. He has a lot of showgirls. A lot of these showgirls have gangster mistresses, okay? Also in the Ansonia is where the Black Sox scandal is really hatched, which Arnold Rothstein eventually becomes a part of. And it's hatched between the ball players and the gamblers when the White Sox players are staying there. But before that, there was a businessman from Chicago, and he was visiting the city and staying at the Ansonia with a woman from Chicago named Buddha Godman, not Goodman, Godman. And she was noted as one of the most attractive women, young women in Chicago. And what she was running, we used the term earlier, bucket shop, and had to explain that term at least to people watching on public, access TV. She was running what was called a badger game. And what's a badger game? A badger game is you're in a hotel room with someone like Buddha Godman, and all of a sudden, police or detectives burst in. But they ain't police or detectives. What they are blackmailers. And they are going to rat you out either to your wife or to the general public to ruin your substantial reputation, or say you transported a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, and that's a federal offense. That's violation of the Mann Act. And so she pulls this on a Chicago businessman, and what he does is he says, I ain't paying. He ain't paying. And she has to actually flee New York for a while, but then she comes back and becomes the mistress of Charles Stoneham. So that's the type of stories and the interactions that we come across, which we were not looking for when we started, but we found that this topic was a gift that kept on giving. Sports. Well, sports is a part of the story. We find, and again, the interaction between people. Let's take another name, and one which probably may be more familiar to you, and that is George Raft, the actor, the famed, he was supposed to be, had a reputation as being sort of a gangster himself. He also had a reputation for turning down all sorts of movie roles. So he'd be offered maybe something like the Maltese Falcon, and he said, I don't want to do that. And he'd do this over and over again. He turned down some of the biggest roles in Hollywood. Raft was a product of the west side of Manhattan, grew up poor but this dishonest lad, was at some point even a professional boxer. But early on, he falls into the orbit of a real live gangster from the West Side, known as Owen, the Killer Madden. When a guy has a nickname like the Killer, watch out for him. And in fact, he goes up the river early on in his career to Sing Sing, is let loose after just a few years after killing somebody in a brawl over a woman at a tavern. This is pre-prohibition on the west side. Comes out and becomes one of the bigger bootleggers in the city. And Raft is a big associate and pal of his. He is also a wonderful dancer. You wouldn't think this, but George Raft had a reputation as being the best Charleston dancer in America in the 1920s. So much so, where one of his earliest occupations is as a dancer at Texas Guinan's Speakeasy. Now, the location or type of location you cannot avoid in doing this book or talking about New York City in the 20s is speakeasies. Particularly the West 50s are just lousy with speakeasies. You know how maybe West 46th Street is Restaurant Row to this day. So imagine speakeasy. There were supposedly thousands in the city, which may be an overestimation, but there were a lot of them, and there were a lot of them in the 50s. And you can find the addresses of so many of them in the daily press. If you take a look at the motion pictures of the time, and even afterwards, these speakeasies are incredibly large and ornate, and there's hundreds of showgirls, doing high kicks and all that, and maybe waterfalls, and just crazy things in these things. Well, they're not usually like that because they are, illegal operations. Some of them, might feature good food and maybe even good booze that wouldn't poison you, but a lot of them are simply in basements. A lot of them are above garages. There are an awful lot of them above garages. And so Raft is a dancer in one of these. Ruby Keeler, who's the star of these Gold Digger movies with Dick Powell in the early 30s. She gets her start there. Also, another dancer in these speakeasies who you don't associate with maybe being a dancer, but goes on to be a really big name, much more remembered now than George Raft, is Barbara Stanwyck. Just a poor girl from Brooklyn, but she's got to make a living, and she's a dancer in several of these clubs. And so these speakeasies are often the site of incredible violence and muscling in by the mob. It's not just a question of, you've bought a few bottles of booze and you set them up and maybe offer some cheese and crackers or whatever, and George Raft doing the Charleston. But the mobsters will be a part of it. So even one of the more famous speakeasies, which is run by the very lovable, a guy you don't associate with being anywhere near the mob because he seemed like such a wholesome old guy, Jimmy Durante. He was a cabaret actor. A lot of these guys, a lot of the entertainers who go on the careers that we know for decades to get their start in vaudeville or burlesque. But Jimmy Durante and his act of Jackson, Clayton, and Durante start there, and he's running a club. And so he is, Arnold Rothstein is running crap games underneath his club. And there's another fellow who goes on to a big career from the speakeasies, and his name is Billy Rose. Billy Rose, among his clubs, he runs a club called the Backstage Club, which is set up to look sort of like the backstage, the back of a stage with all the lights and the ropes and the curtains going in. So you've got this showbiz feel for the patrons. But he's doing very well, and he's approached by one of these them and those guys, and says, you got a nice establishment here. I think I'd like to have a part of it. No, I'm not looking for any partners. No, thank you. Well, I think you should. And the next night or that night, it's raided, and all his booze is smashed. And then, you think that over? No, I don't want a partner. And it's raided again. And this goes on for about 3 nights, and then finally, for $1,000, which may seem like big bucks in 1920s dollars, but it's not that big a deal if you're raking it in at a very fashionable club, 25% of the club goes to this fellow. Except it really doesn't go to this fellow because he's fronting for Arnold Rothstein, who is paying off the police and the judges, et cetera, et cetera. The Raft, by the way, getting back to him, he's involved with Oni Madden and could be used to convince certain prize fighters to take a dive. So we see that is going on in the city as well. One of Madden's big projects as a fight manager is Primo Carnera. I mean, it goes all the way up. It goes all the way up to heavyweight championship of the world. Carnero is not a good fighter, but shall we say he had friends in high or low places. There's a category of incidents, of locations in the book, which I didn't pay too much attention to in writing the original Rothstein book. And I didn't pay that much attention to what his role was. But it's jewel robberies. Now, one of the themes of those Turner Classic Movie pre-code films is jewel robberies. And you see, John Barrymore is going to rob Greta Garbo's jewels in Grand Hotel, or in another movie it might be William Powell going after Kay Francis's jewels, and after Kay Francis for that matter. But you see over and over again in that era very high profile jewel robberies, one after another. And what's the reason for that? People evidently carried around a lot more jewelry than they do now. And it was, must have been a way of flaunting your wealth, showing your wealth, of decorating the female form, etc. There is, in the early 30s, a series of newspaper articles in the Hearst Press written by the wife of one of these jewel robberies. It's a guy named Harry Sittemore. And Sittemore, according to his wife, in the early 30s, when his career is not yet over, he's just indisposed at that point, courtesy of the authorities, but he'll get out and he'll go back to work. That at that point he had stolen $10 million worth of jewels and had fenced $1 million of which through Arnold Rothstein. And she contends that one of the big sources of Rothstein's, or she says the biggest source of Rothstein's money over the years was really fencing stolen property, specifically jewels, rather than gambling. Now, Buddha Godman, we return to her, was also involved in one of these jewel robberies in 1932, where there's a industrialist, and he has hanging around the house or apartment, his name is Harry Glemby, $305,000 worth of jewels. The cops break this up or solve this case in part because she tries to fence this stuff. Arnold Rothstein is dead. She can't fence it through him. And they send in an undercover agent, supposedly a guy from out of town. Intriguingly, he uses the alias Rothstein. He is not Rothstein. And what she does is she makes love to him to distract him, and is going to try to pass off not the jewels that she has stolen from Glenby, but just a bag of paste jewels with him. I mean, the crookedness never ends with these people. So she's arrested. Stoneham, who was very loyal to everyone, it seems, except his wife, was willing to stand by her. One of her associates committed suicide. One of the morals of the book is crime. Crime does not pay, at least for the bunch of people here. We see that one of Arnold Rothstein's associates, a gambler named Jimmy Meehan, in the Astoria Hotel, robs a woman named Diana Lanzetta of $2,500 worth of jewels, which is pretty small picking for this stuff. Why I mention this robbery? One, because of this guy's association to Rothstein. He was one of the last people to see Rothstein before Rothstein's murder, but also because she was the sister-in-law of a Democratic congressman from East Harlem, a Democratic congressman who beat Lee Fiorello LaGuardia for his seat and later became head of the Women's National Democratic Club. There were murders associated with these jewel robberies, one of which was with a woman named Louise Lawson. She was chloroformed to death in 1924 at her Upper West Side apartment for $15,000 worth of jewels. Interestingly enough, those jewels had been insured by Arnold Rothstein. So he knew where these jewels were. Interestingly enough, the policy had lapsed. And so she was chloroformed to death. She is another one of these showgirls who has a big shot boyfriend, sugar daddy. His name was Gerald Dahl, Jerry Dahl, who was the head of one of the big subway lines when the subway lines were still privately owned, or at least one of them was. There's another showgirl jewel robbery murder which is more famous actually at the time, and that's of Dot King, and that's at 144 West 57th Street. Not only it's $30,000 worth of jewels this time, and not only are they insured by Arnold Rothstein, but the building is owned by Arnold Rothstein. Her sugar daddy is a Philadelphia socialite named J. Kearsley Mitchell, and her live-in boyfriend is named Alberto Santos Guimarães. Guimarães gets out of suspicion because he has another girlfriend, a socialite girlfriend, who swears she was with him at the time. Later on, she falls out of a window in Washington, D.C., and on her deathbed says, "You know, I lied about that alibi." And there are no charges brought against him. Often you see mysterious cases of charges not being brought against these people. Legs Diamond there's a big rap sheet of him from the Daily Press in the book, and it's like, arrested, and everything is he's let go on all the charges. It's dangerous to hold some of these gambling events, shall we say, card games. The oldest established permanent floating crap game in New York, Rothstein pioneers that. Because, you could be robbed. You could be robbed. The bad guys may want to take the bad guy's money. Or you could be raided by the police. So one time, Rothstein hears a knock on the door during one of his games, and figures he's going to be robbed by some goons because he just had been robbed a few months before, and takes action. And the action is to fire 3 shots through that door. Each shot nicks a police officer, and he gets off. He gets off. How does he get off? Well, the police are not interested in pursuing the case. He has friends. The magistrate is not interested. But also, being the big bankroll, he's able to instantly provide, well, the cops couldn't see through the door, and all the other people in the room are provided bail by Arnold Rothstein, and they never saw anything, even though a revolver was being fired through that door. Rothstein's bodyguards could be a particularly bad bunch, and that leads us to some Capital District locations, which are referenced in the book, but not, part of the actual tours. Legs Diamond was like a guy named Red Moran. Red Moran was one of these jewel thieves, but Diamond was for a while protecting shipments that were coming in on Long Island of bootleg gin for Rothstein, and protecting Rothstein's life for a while. He dies on Lark Street, I believe, in a home owned this day by William Kennedy, who did the book Legs, and it's up for sale now. He also operated in the Catskills to great effect. He was on trial in Troy the night before he is killed. His brother Eddie, who was tubercular, dies up at Saranac Lake not long before that. But the real connections from the areas or locations in this book are to Saratoga Springs, because even then Saratoga was the August place to be. And so train loads, I mean literally train loads of professional bookmakers would go up to Saratoga to do their business during the track season. Arnold Rothstein is married at a house still standing on Washington Street, kind of far out from the downtown, by the Justice of the Peace in Saratoga. He owns a gambling house there, which was out of town. Being out of town, it had to be particularly elegant. It was in the town of Greenfield. And what's there now? Because it burned down. Things sometimes burn down in these circles, and his place burned down after he sold it, and sold it to one of his associates. The headquarters of the Stewart's Corporation now sits on that property. Yeah. And also, the best man at his wedding in Saratoga is Herbert Bayard Swope, who becomes involved in one of the higher profile murders of a gambler. He wasn't killing anyone, but he was being fed from information, and that gambler got silenced by a police lieutenant who was the first cop to go to the chair in American history. But also there are gambling houses. Before there are floating crap games, there are a bunch of stationary gambling houses in the West 40s and 50s owned by, among others, Arnold Rothstein, and before him, a guy named, and this guy was a hero of Arnold Rothstein, because even villains have heroes. And this guy is named Richard Canfield, okay, as in the Canfield Casino in Saratoga. So if you can, go see that place. One of the questions, I think in my first interview on this book, was from Bob Cudmore, and said, so where can you go visit these places that are still standing? Because, in the West 40s have seen some development. So some of the theaters are there. Arnold Rothstein bankrolls Broadway shows, okay? he bankrolls the first or the longest running show of the 1920s, something called Abe's Irish Rose. And it's the plot of, you know, Irish girl marries Jewish guy. And, you know, we're still seeing variations on that. Bridget loves Bernie, you know. And so that show opened. The playwright, director, producer, Ann Nichols sees that it's not doing good business, but believes in it and says, you know, if I get enough money to keep it open, it's gonna build. It's gonna build, damn it. And who's got the money? Arnold Rothstein's got the money. I'll go see him. And he gives her the money. And among what he does, I don't know if, did I mention this earlier, that when he takes out an insurance policy or issues one, or when he gives out a loan, he also issues an insurance policy. You take out an insurance policy from him, and he's the beneficiary. So when he says, you'll pay back and God help you if you don't, he means it. And so she takes out one of these policies. And she said, you know, you could have a piece of this show. And he says, no, I just want the interest. He could have made maybe millions or hundreds of thousands from the show, but he gets a little too greedy on that. He also bankrolls helps build the Selwyn Theater, still there in 42nd Street, and bankrolls one of the first black shows up on a theater on West 63rd Street. So he's, like I say, he's involved in all sorts of things. There are also, in terms of places you can also visit, the Park Central Hotel, which is still there, which is where Arnold Rothstein was killed. And again, multiple connections in a building. In 1957, Albert Anastasia, the boss of Murder Incorporated, is shot there on the first floor while he's getting a shave. Sardi's. Sardi's doesn't quite have a direct connection to these guys that I could find, but it dates from that era. And like I said, there are characters that you find that you weren't looking for and had no conception of in the course of this. Sardi's, for a long time, early in its career, had a famous hat check girl. Her name was Renee Carroll. She had previously worked at Texas Guinan's Speakeasy and come across Arnold Rothstein. There was a little bandinage, shall we say, between them. He tried to pick her up and failed. But what she would do is, she wasn't really hot stuff, okay? It wasn't like Jean Harlow was checking your hat or anything like that. But what she was smart. And so Broadway producers, actors, investors would hand her, aside from their hat, screenplays, scripts, and say, look at this. Look at this. I trust your judgment. Should I back this? Should I star in this? Should I have anything to do with this? And over the course of her career behind that counter at Sardi's, she read 5,000 scripts and even had a radio show in the early 30s. So the damnedest stuff you find in the annals of Times Square in those days. The prostitution all over the place. Polly Adler, there's a new book out on her, which was fairly well received. She was operated multiple locations and wrote a book. Wrote a book early on her career, which told some things, but not other things. And we also have the attorneys. We have a number of attorneys who are quite famous at that time. are real mobster-related attorneys. When Arnold Rothstein is killed or is shot at the Park Central Hotel, he lingers for a night or two, and he's taken to the Polyclinic Hospital on the west side, where, among other people, Rudolph Valentino was taken, and Marilyn Monroe was taken twice. I think it was appendicitis or something. So you would get a number of people there. What Cantor did was, and he wasn't the last attorney to be nailed on this, when Rothstein dies, he takes and has a will, which was being revised, but never had been somehow signed by Arnold Rothstein, and puts it under his dying hand, and there is this terrible scrawl. And eventually what happens is the fight for Arnold Rothstein's assets, which were in the millions at one point, eventually whittles down to almost nothing within the course of a decade, as his heirs and supposed heirs and wannabe heirs fight over all these things. One of the assets he had, and one of the reasons why his fortune is diminished at that point, is he's had a run of bad luck. He starts to lose at poker and at the races, at the track. He's invested heavily in a nefarious scheme of Queens real estate to basically create a Potemkin village, which is then going to be bought by the city of New York. I'll build this, and it's just garbage, you know. It's like barely made out of cardboard, these houses, and then it will be sold to the city and demolished, and I'll make some money in the meantime. But he's tied up with that, and also he's tied up with the international drug trade. So that when he dies, and you will see any number of raids in the millions of dollars of drugs which are coming in from Europe and the Orient. That is basically the end of the Rothstein story, and it's the end of the story as I'm giving it here today, but not, if you want more details, they're all in the book. Thank you all for coming today, and I will take questions. Yes, Dan.
David, once again, Tammany Hall is in this book, right? It was in the Rothstein book. Just a little background of the politics of what Tammany Hall played during that era.
Yeah, Tammany Hall goes back a long way. It goes back to Aaron Burr. Okay, so we got violence even at the beginning of the story, with particularly with Alexander Hamilton involved, and they run the city. Every so often they get thrown out by the reformers, but the reformers lack staying power. Tammany has there. I have a couple of extensive quotes towards the beginning of the book from people involved in Tammany. One is a ward leader on the Lower East Side, and the other is a guy named Nathan Birkin, who is the foremost entertainment and copyright lawyer in the country. He will represent United Artists, Paramount, MGM, Chaplin, Pickford, Fairbanks, yeah, all these big. They did have some talent involved with it. It wasn't just lowlifes, and they do produce. They produce Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York, and they produce Robert Wagner, United States Senator, who had been a state senator and is the Wagner Labor Relations Act and Social Security. So he's big, but there with Tammany comes baggage. Who at one point worked for Robert Wagner? This is not Robert Wagner the son, who was later the mayor of New York City. A judge named, or a clerk who becomes a Supreme Court judge named Judge Joseph Force Crater. We have the sites related to Judge Crater in the book. Judge Crater is famous because around 1931, with the good guys closing in on the crooked judges in the city, all Tammany. He goes out of his office one day and goes to Billy Haas's Chop House in the West 40s. He has bought tickets for a Broadway show, which he has already seen in Atlantic City. Okay, so this is a mystery too. Steps into a taxi cab on the street and is never seen again. And it's one of the great mysteries of the early 20th century. It was quite well known. The theories, that he just scrams at one point, or he was taken to Coney Island and the bad guys were trying to beat some sense into him and beat too much sense into him, and so he was buried under the boardwalk, or that he had gone to Polly Adler's, one of Polly Adler's establishments, and then just keeled over in the course of things and had to be dumped in the Hudson River. But he was gone, and who appointed him? It wasn't Robert Wagner, it was Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Roosevelt, who had originally started his career as an opponent of Tammany, settles onto accommodations with them, particularly with Al Smith, and then has to break them up when all these scandals erupt after following the death of Arnold Rothstein, and force out that mayor who kind of started this whole thing, Mayor James J. Walker, who again, one of those fellows with a showgirl girlfriend, and he has to flee to England and France, to Europe, to avoid prosecution. And that's how we end up with Fiorello LaGuardia as mayor. We also name in the book some of the Broadway shows and movies which open in Broadway in that area. And one of the bigger shows which deals with that era, of course, there's Guys and Dolls, but also a big hit in the 1960s which dealt very directly with this. It was called Fiorello, ! And it starred Tom Bosley as Fiorello LaGuardia. And there was a song in it, which I started to sing for an interviewer yesterday, called A Little Tin Box. And it went something like this: a little tin box which a little tin key unlocks, blah, 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 blah. And what the origin of that is, there was a senator or a sheriff from, I think, Brooklyn, named Tom Farley or something Farley. And what they would do is the investigators would say, "Sir, you're earning $2,000 a year, and yet you have $250,000 in your bank account. How is this possible?" And he said, "I gave up smoking, and I brought my lunch to work each day in a brown paper bag. And with the money I saved, I put it into a little tin box. And the savings accumulated up and up." And they said, "That was a wonderful box, wasn't it, Sheriff?" And he said, "It was a marvelous box." He was forced out of office too, but such were the times. Yes, sir. And then you.
Seem to have a political, right now, of thinking all politicians are crooks, and it's terrible, but it seems like the history is endless.
It's original sin. It's been there for a while, and it's going to keep going. Yeah, I think they hadn't quite figured out that the things not to do or how to do them better back then, because we're just coming into that income tax thing. How they nailed Capone, and later on they nail one of the big Tammany bosses for income tax evasion, a guy named Jimmy Hines, who was the boss of West Harlem. Dewey nails him in the late 30s. He was the protector of, well, the numbers racket starts with the black population in Harlem. And then guys like Dutch Schultz take it over, and Schultz is protected by Hines. Hines was also the protector of George McManus, who was the guy who was arrested and indicted and ultimately cleared, but I would say, of killing Arnold Rothstein in that Park Central Hotel. But yeah, I mean, the politicians are all over the story, and they make it possible. Yeah.
I had heard that Rothstein was mentor to Lucky Luciano.
Yes.
And the whole Italian arm of the mob began kind of with Arnold.
Yeah, and Meyer Lansky. Lansky says that basically teaches him that, like, you know, don't run a shabby place. Don't run a place where a guy who wins $2,000 is going to be clubbed over the head when he's leaving the place in the dark. Make it look well, look, what do they have on all the billboards in Albany here? Win $300 million. They want to advertise that people win. That's what draws people in. So that's one of the lessons that he teaches Lansky, and he had learned that in a way from watching the type of establishment that Canfield ran in Saratoga and in the West 40s. You know, have a nice carpet, have some nice furnishing. If you give them a feed, you know, make it worthwhile. Bring the swells in, because as Willie Sutton, the guy, the famous bank robber, said, they asked him, why do you rob banks? He says, that's where the money is. Don't bother winning the money from the poor people. Win it from the rich people. But lucky Luciano later said that Rothstein taught him how to dress. He was arrested for and suspected of snitching on his associates. And he needed to pick his reputation up. And he says, well, you know, invite all these politicians and newspaper people to the fights with ringside tickets, and also dress yourself up. Don't forget this off the rack stuff. I got some nice ties here from Solka in Paris. Dress this way. Dress conservatively. But when Rothstein is killed, Luciano is one of the guys picked up on suspicion, or what? Well, it was McManus. It was really McManus. They had trouble figuring out. It was only they knew Rothstein had been called to go to the room, which was McManus's room under an alias at the Park Central. They could not prove that Rothstein was in the room, okay? And they could not prove it because Rothstein was shot once in the gut. And the bullet's trajectory went like this. Rothstein only bled internally, okay? There was no blood in the room. There were no witnesses that he ever got to the room, okay? So that was one of the problems that they had in placing him in the room. Although there was a remarkable switcheroo, was that Rothstein and McManus seemed to have they had the same tailor. So they had the identical overcoats, and it was early November. And McManus's overcoat is found in the room, but Rothstein's is not. McManus grabbed the wrong overcoat, okay? So, I mean, we really know, you know, who was in the room and all that. Now, some people say, well, was this a professional hit? This is a professional hit, right? I go, absolutely not. Why not? If I'm a professional and you're my victim, if I'm Albert Anastasia and I'm Murder Incorporated, I do not shoot you once in the gut and allow you to walk out of the room and down the stairs to be picked up by the police and taken to a hospital to live for 2 days. I blow your head off several times. This was done by a non-professional and a guy, and probably by a big drunken Irishman, like McManus. Said they found all sorts of empty glasses in the room, liquor glasses, none of which had a fingerprint on them. Yeah, how did that happen? How did that happen? Some police officers were relieved of their responsibilities afterwards. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question. Well, the
Frank Costello also worked with him. Yeah, with Rothstein. Yes.
the jewel thieves or whatever made me think of Saratoga, and as I'm sure you're well aware that the mob ran casinos up there in the 30s and 40s and whatnot. I read somewhere, I'm talking about the track and wagering. Art Rooney, who
Oh yeah, he was
on the
and Wellington Marrow was a bookmaker.
yeah, but I read, maybe I misread it, that Art Rooney made a wager of $250,000 on one race. Is that possible?
Yeah.
I mean, those
Rothstein would win.
And lose $300,000 on it in a day. Yeah, these were also in
who was going to win the race.
well, yes. There was Rothstein was known as a sure thing gambler. I mean, if you're willing to have a sure thing on the World Series, why not on the racetrack, which is a milieu, shall we say, that you're far more familiar with. In Saratoga, there was let's see if I have the numbers here. Probably not that number. No, I don't have the numbers. But one night at the Brook, there was a guy named Subway Sam Rosoff. Rosoff was a real illiterate immigrant entrepreneur construction guy. He had the contracts to do the subways. Imagine, like an entire subway line, not just, the 2nd Avenue line now. And so he had money, and he loved to gamble, and he was gambling at the Brook, Rothstein's house one day, and gambling house. And so he's losing. He's ahead of the game, like maybe $200,000-$300,000. And Rothstein does not have that amount of cash in the house at that moment. But he knows who does have the money in Saratoga. It's the guy we started with, Charles A. Stoneham. And he says, Charlie, help, send money. I don't want to close because that makes me look bad. It makes me look like a Welsher. It's like, I can't handle this. I got to look like I can handle anything. Send over some money. How much money you got in your safe? And, like $100,000 in Saratoga. He's traveling with this amount of money. And he does. But by the end of the night, Rosoff's fortunes change. And I think he loses like $40,000. Okay? So he flips like that. Rosoff at one point after Rothstein's death, there's like some union disturbance with the Sandhogs union, okay? I mean, it wasn't called the Sandhogs, but they were the Sandhogs. And they're trying to unionize his operations. And he says, this guy's making trouble for me, and, he better watch it, or, like, he could get killed. And he gets killed, and there's no prosecution. Yeah. So that's the stakes were extremely high early on in these games.
Was this Stoneham, Charles Stoneham?
Oh yeah, you came in late. Yeah, this is Charles Stoneham, who owned the New York Giants. This is Horace Stoneham's father.
Oh,
Yeah. He was a stockbroker.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Did any of this money get into legitimate businesses? Like, you know, I'm Madden, they're really big with the construction in Bethlehem.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know anything about them, but Rothstein would own a lot of, like I said, a lot of real estate, and that would be, or lending the money for Broadway theaters or investing in, the first big Broadway show with an all-black cast was called Shuffle Along. And then he invested in Keep Shufflin', and that was like with Fats Waller. So I guess that would be like a legitimate operation.
No, I was thinking more of businesses. And you mentioned the name Merrill. Clint Merrill.
Mara. The Maras who owned the New York Giants years ago. Or may still do. I guess they don't. I don't know. Yeah. But no. Okay, are we, did I see a hand almost raised?
Well, I was going to say, I heard when they were questioning Rothstein on his deathbed.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
To name the murderer.
Yes.
And they asked, I don't know if you heard that, supposedly, when it was asked, who killed you? He said, your mother.
Well, he said, my mother did it. Which doesn't quite sound like, well, he could be sarcastic, which I think helped get him shot.
How old was he when he was killed?
Early to mid 40s. You know, crime is a young man's game, you know? So he dies, so many of these guys die young. He might have lived a long time if he didn't get shot, because he lived a sort of healthy lifestyle. He didn't drink. He drank a lot of milk, ate a lot of cake, had false teeth very early on, though. Anyway, well, thank you all for coming.